Hi, good evening everyone. Welcome to the first episode in the conversation series that Vidhi Maharashtra will be hosting this year. The conversation series is called Up The Ante Mumbai, Uch Apeksha. And the idea behind this conversation series actually came to the team. We were ideating about it last year, sometime I think in July or August. We had launched a book suggesting 15 legal reforms for the state government of Maharashtra. And we launched the book last year in June, and we had a panel discussion to sort of launch the book. Ma'am was also a part of that panel discussion. And we had a very enthusiastic audience that day. We had a musical performance by Amita Bhide. After the panel discussion, there were some interesting observations that came from the discussion. I think one sort of observation that came from that discussion was, this idea of moving away from sustainability to the idea of just cities, because the conversation in the panel discussion was, the topic of the discussion was balancing economic progress and ecological sustainability. And once that panel discussion got over, I think one of the conversations that happened was that let's talk about just cities, let's talk about fair cities. And even after the panel discussion, we had a lot of young students, people come to us sort of and tell us that they were very happy to be a part of that discussion, that they wanted to be a part of more such discussions like this. And there was this recurring question as to what they could do to contribute to law and policy making in the state, make a difference, etc. And that sort of got us thinking that perhaps we should do more of these conversations, and we should do it on a sustained basis, in a focused manner. And that's the idea behind this conversation series. It was sort of born that way. And what we thought was that given this year that we are going to polls at the national level, at the state assembly level, perhaps, I don't know, at the VNC level as well, it is even more important to have these conversations this year. And we decided to sort of start this series and pick up like one, urban planning or governance issue in our immediate surroundings, which is Bombay. Call a subject matter expert and have a deep dive into that sort of issue, discuss law and policy suggestions, and sort of go at it in a very targeted and focused manner, as opposed to a surface level manner. So that was the idea behind the conversation series. The first episode of the conversation series is on today, and I have with me our first speaker, Dr. Amita Bhide, who's currently a professor at the Tata Institute of Social Sciences. And ma'am has a very illustrious career. She has been involved in issues related to urban poor communities, community organization and housing rights movement, and advocacy too. She is extensively researched on urban development, urban local governance, planning, water and sanitation, housing and land issues. And Professor is not just an academic, she has also headed several action research projects that seek to create a model of inclusive development in Indian cities. Not just this, Professor Bhide also heads the Transforming M Ward project, which is a field action project working in the M East Ward in Mumbai. So she also has some ground level experience coming through her research, through her field action projects. So we thought that we could have ma'am come and speak to us today about Mumbai's relationship with its informal urban settlements. That is something what the law terms as slums. So just the idea as to how this relationship has evolved over the years, what are law and policy responses to these urban settlements, where is the law and policy failing, and what can we do to sort of fix those gaps in law and policy. So that is the idea behind the first conversation that we are going to do today. And without further ado, I think I'll just start off with my first question, ma'am. Firstly, thank you for being a part of this conversation. You've been a part of previously the events as well, and we're very grateful to have you today as well. The first question that I have for you is actually, I'll just start off with some data, for the audience actually. Is that as per the National Sample Survey data of 2012, Maharashtra has the highest number of slums in urban India. Over 20% of the total slums in urban India are located in Maharashtra, and this houses close to 40% of urban India's total slum dwelling population. The average slum size also the highest in Maharashtra. And as per information placed before the Parliament in 2022, Mumbai, India's financial capital, has around 2,400 slums, As per the 2011 census, so this is very dated information, approximately 6.53 million people, that is around 40 to 42% of the city's population is living in slums. I think the number is much higher, it's close to 50%, but this is as per census 2011. So much so that we've now had an Oscar-winning movie that was based on Mumbai slums, and contrastingly, Maharashtra is also the richest state in the country and it has the financial capital. So you see this sort of contrast happening in terms of the kind of people who are living in these informal settlements and the state's gross state domestic product, its contribution to the Indian economy, etc. And it's very difficult to sort of, reconcile these two things, is the first thought that I have. So my first question to you actually is that you've studied the very city, you've studied the city very closely, and also, I've read your fantastic profile on the socio-spatial transformation of the city of Bombay right from the colonial times up until today. So my question to you is, what are some of the main reasons that we are here today, in this sort of a position that I just narrated by way of facts? What are some of the main reasons we are here today?
So I'd like to respond. Firstly, thanks Vidhi and to you as well, Chinali. Both for, I think the idea behind the conversations itself is very interesting, and I'm happy to be a contributor to whatever value that it adds to this and to public discourses in the city, because I do think that Mumbai as a city desperately needs public discourses and much more debate around issues, and we are fairly silent about that in many ways. Okay. Having said that, to come to the very specific question that you asked, I'm going to respond to this question in two ways. Firstly, I think our assumption is that the slum as a category or as whatever label has remained the same through the days of colonialism to now. Whereas I will argue that the form of the slum, the nature of the slum, why slums exist are all very different in all of these three periods. I'll just give a very brief illustration here. So when we became independent at that point in time, roughly around 1947 or so, it was estimated that Mumbai had about 5% people in slums. Okay? And when that is contrasted with the 1976 was the first time that a slum census was organized in the city. At that time we came up with the number of 40% of city's population coming up as slums. And what is the obvious conclusion that gets drawn from this? Hey, how bad we are, right? There were only 5% slums before independence. The British were able to manage the city much better, right? But the reality of the fact is really that the colonizers were very effective in exporting the issues outside the boundary of the city. Right? So for example, tanning as an economic activity or alcohol brewing as an activity. Though the British, there were no restrictions or norms around not drinking, etc. This is a very permissive society in terms of drinking alcohol. But yet, drinking and brewing alcohol was definitely considered to be not belonging in the city. So both of these activities were just kind of banned in the city and they were compelled to move outside. Okay. Where did they move outside? To a group of island called Dharavi, and this is actually the beginning of Dharavi. Right? But Dharavi was then outside the city, outside the limits of the city. So its population doesn't get counted within the city. So the 5% that we are talking of are all manual labor, largely head loaders and others who work in the docks. Okay. And at that point in time, even areas like which comprised of more dilapidated buildings or inadequate building structures were called slums. So this is the form of the slum in pre-colonial Bombay. Right? Come to post-independence, there are two things which really in some ways let loose. Okay? The first is the fact that we continue to grow our industries in Mumbai. So in addition to textile mills which had already begun in the city, there were now engineering industries, pharmaceutical industries, there were chemical industries which were added to the mix, and all of these required labor, blue-collared labor, which may not be skilled labor, which really required hard toil. Right? There was a lot of public sector development, and in order to serve public sector employees, you bring in a set of service giving people and service providers. Right? So Shirish Patel, one of the very renowned planners and engineers who has contributed a lot to the city, estimates that for every one formal sector job which is created, there are 8 informal sector people who come to the city. So now you can estimate what began to happen to Mumbai, what kind of people then started migrating in to Mumbai, and where would they stay. Because by this time, housing had really assumed a crisis form. And the nature of slums, which therefore got created in the post-independence era, were really people coming from different regions from Mumbai. They were migrants, and they really formed the backbone of labor, or as Dr. Sandeep Pendse calls it, they were the shramiks or the toilers of the city. I think that's the very, where did they live? Now they began to live on extremely risky lands, because post-independence also brought in a level of planning which tried to cover the entire city. And with that kind of master planning, there was no space for the poor at all, especially no lands for the poor. So the poor started occupying environmentally risky lands, fringe lands, marginal lands, or made lands from forests, from swamps, right? And this is the nature of the slum in the post-independence period. We come to a third period where industry started declining and real estate started emerging as the big economy of the city. And that is where you now see that the term slum, the phenomenon of the slum, gets very different dimensions. Because now what the slum is basically, it becomes a real estate frontier. Second, it becomes a political constituency. Thirdly, it becomes a service provider's den. Fourthly, it becomes a hub of industry, informal industry. Because while manufacturing couldn't survive in the city, in the large setups that it had, all the industry that exists in Mumbai currently is basically in slums. So if you look at Dharavi, for example, it's really, you cannot imagine Dharavi as just an area where there are residents. It's not a residential area, it's a highly industrial and commercial, not just commercial, industrial and commercial area. So I think this term slum is firstly not the same. The form had changed. The second part of this question that you asked me is giving me the statistics of Maharashtra and also talking about the contrast between prosperity on one hand and the formation of the slum on the other. Okay? And I would say that it is like the nature of prosperity that we have also demands the kind of inequity, and given the kind of inequity, demands the slum. Okay? Both of them go hand in hand. The same forces that create prosperity are also the same forces which also create the slum. And I think that is something which definitely needs to be borne in mind. The kind of pattern of and the way we have used urban development in Maharashtra, which is very, very spatially focused, and the kind of investments in big capital, the lack of opportunities for the toilers to the perhaps the low skill employment, it's mismatched with the kind of in-migration which happens to the city. I think all of this is really reflected in this high proportion of slum dwellers in Maharashtra.
Thank you. No, I think it's quite interesting, is what you said, is that both, you need one for the other to survive. It goes hand in hand. Because what I see is, and you've written quite extensively about it, is that you want these people to work for you. You want their labor, but yet you don't want to acknowledge their very existence when you are planning your cities. Which gets me to my second question, which is on planning laws and policies. So the Maharashtra Regional and Town Planning Act, you have the concept of a development plan, which is supposed to be made once every 20 years. And do these development plans, firstly, are they even implemented? Secondly, do they make sense in the current context? I mean, can we do a long-term vision of 20 years for a city by way of a development plan? Do these development plans even account for these people in the slums? And if not, if these plans are failing, if they are not being implemented, if they are not realistic, if they are not accounting for all people in the city, is there scope for us to review our planning laws, and policies, and perhaps revamp them, So what are your thoughts on that, and what is the sort of reform needed when we are planning our cities? Is my second question.
It's a very important question, but equally difficult to also perhaps respond to. So my first question, I think the reflection part on the review of the plans, I think is a little simpler one. I'll begin with that. Because I think the relationship between planning and the formation or creating space for inclusion is really a very antithetical one. There are very few plans which are implemented unless they are in the capital cities, like NCR has a fairly large proportion of implementation, or you may see this in Chandigarh or Bhubaneswar, or perhaps Rourkela, some of the public sector cities like Bhilai and so on and so forth. Okay. But otherwise, in Mumbai, the proportion has ranged from 8% to 10-12%. That's it. Okay. But my question, I think the real point of reflection is what would have happened if all the plans were implemented to a T. Okay. And the results would have been disastrous for the poor. Okay. Disastrous in two ways. Okay. So I'll first talk about what is proposed in the plan. Okay. Within planning frameworks itself, there is no acknowledgement of who are we planning for. Okay. So it talks of a generalized public interest. Okay. And that is where I think planning goes firstly kind of weak on its overall premise. Okay. There is something called generalized public interest, which is not classed or which is not divided across different segments. That's like the first thing. And the experience all over the country, including Mumbai, of specific provisions for economically weaker sections, as they call them, have been very bad. For example, there was a time where a lot of private land was thought to be acquired by plans, or how state housing boards creating spaces through plans and allocating, let's say, for example, Madhya Pradesh has a very explicit provision of 10% EWS housing, okay, or 10% provisioning for EWS in the form of plots. Okay. These have subsequently then also been taken on by some other city. For example, Pune had this provision. The actual evaluation of many of these actually suggests that all of these spaces have actually been appropriated by the not so poor. Okay. In fact, so there are many other these kind of subversions. Okay. There is the other part of the plans, right? And the other part of the plans is the existing settlements, however, are completely absent from the plan. Like the most interesting example perhaps that I would suggest is in the 1960s plan, where just prior to the plan, Mumbai's boundaries had been extended to take on Salsette and other regions. The train had also started moving beyond Andheri and as suburban train, I'm talking about. There were fairly large numbers of chawls just beyond Andheri, in Jogeshwari, in Goregaon. So, and these are all located really on private lands. So after the slum laws came in, the chawls get a nomenclature of they are slums. In the 1964 development plan, none of these settlements are shown as existing, though many of them show existence which is even prior. Okay? So they are there, but they are not seen on the development plan. And therefore, the proposed land use plan in the development plan shows that there will be 40-meter wide roads or 80-meter wide roads which will be created as a east-west link for Mumbai. Okay. For nearly 30 years, nothing happens. Sab kuch alvel, the settlements are growing, there is no road, it is only a proposed road. Then comes in the World Bank. Okay. And the World Bank proposes a transport project, which is now called the Mumbai Urban Transport Project. And with the help of the World Bank funds, then a resettlement policy which is set into motion, the Jogeshwari-Vikroli link road takes shape. All of these people and all of these settlements are then considered encroachers. Okay? So the simple question to ask is, what came first, the settlement or the plan? Okay? So here the plan came later in this case, but yet the entire invisibility in the plan is something that has not been, that has immense repercussions subsequently. In the current development plan which was being made, there was an entire campaign in the city which tried to argue and basically say that all existing settlements need to be recorded in the ALU. Okay. After a lot of struggle, they did get recorded. But how? As large resettlement areas with no boundaries between them. Okay. So this is the first time that happened. And this resistance actually tells you firstly that underlying the premise of the plan is basically that a plan is made by property holders. They are considered the single most important stakeholder in relation to the plan. And whatever we talk of as public interest, inclusion, the objectives of the plan, all of these are actually in some ways secondary. Now, what should we do? That's the third part of your question, right? What should we do? How should we reform this system? This kind of a planning won't work if we are to really think of inclusive planning. We need to change the entire paradigm of planning itself and shift it from land ownership or property ownership to thinking about other claim making to the city. Just to give one example here, in Brazil in 2001, post a revolution in Brazil, they brought in a right to city statute. Okay? And the minute the right to city statute was brought in, they said one of the ways in which one can execute right to city is via urban planning. So now the purpose of urban planning itself is shifted. It is no more that abstract public interest, but it also explicitly becomes to deliver the right to city to all citizens, including the most vulnerable, giving them a priority, but also others.
No, I think that's again very interesting. One of the earlier thoughts that we had about this conversation series was to actually call it the Right to the City series. And that's the idea I took to ma'am. And I remember you asking me, over the phone call, Janali, who has the right to the city? Is it only people who have property in the city? Are you going to tell me that only they have the right to the city? Do migrants who come in and out of the city, perhaps live in different areas, but come to Bombay, work throughout the day, generate like economic activity for the city, do they not have a right to the city? And I remember thinking about it and we were discussing it, and eventually we sort of moved away from the Right to the City conversation series to what it is today. But that always stayed with me, and which is why we decided to do this first conversation also on this particular issue, because one of the questions that we want to ask with respect, under this conversation series is not so much as a juridical right, because then you end up in all sorts of legal tangles, hassles, is right to city a recognized right by the Supreme Court or not? What have courts said about it? How can you read it under the Constitution, etc. And if you wanted to avoid that sort of legal hassle for now, and sort of just ask people, what are your expectations from the city? And I think people living across the city, irrespective of whether they are living in a slum settlement, an informal settlement, or a regular housing, expect very basic amenities from the city. They deserve good housing. People want clean water, electricity. They want like a hospital right next to their house. They want a good school for their children. So the first question that we were trying to answer was what are your expectations from the city? And I think we should be speaking for all residents of the city, irrespective of whether they have a property right or not. Because only once we shift from this propertied model to a right to city model, where we speak about all residents, can we actually think about inclusive urbanism. And I think you also mentioned this concept coming from colonial times, which is that the earliest cooperators in the Bombay Municipal Corporation were people who were residents, who had property. Only then they could vote. And that sort of idea has now trickled into even post-independence, where we are only talking about people who have property and who then can enjoy a whole bunch of rights that come with living in a city. So I'll come to my third question, ma'am, and this is now coming to the Slum Act itself, which is the Slum Improvement and Clearance Act. And you've written about, so you just said that the concept of slum has evolved over the years. You've also written about how the law and policy approach to slums has evolved over the years. So earlier it was this idea of negation. It was the idea that we have to demolish them, that they are encroachers, they are on illegal land. To this, sort of tacit acceptance, tolerance towards slum. Although that shift is still not very clear, because we still have penalty provisions under the Act that penalizes encroachers. But this evolution has happened under law and policy, where we have now moved from, let's clear them out, let's demolish them. They are all on illegal, they're all illegal occupants on government land. Most of them are on government lands. To this sort of idea of tacit tolerance, where we are talking about rehabilitation, redevelopment, resettlement. And over here, I see two problems to it that you also identified. One is that, interestingly, this shift from negation to sort of acceptance has gone hand in hand with the introduction of market-linked development incentives, which is basically the TDR, the transferable development right. So, and this TDR used both in the context of slum redevelopment and infrastructure projects, big-time infrastructure projects, has sort of gone hand in hand with this state acceptance, towards slums. What we've also seen is the withdrawal of the state in some way from this entire housing sector, and more private sector intervention, where the state is actually allowing private parties to intervene and develop these projects, take up these projects, and sort of withdrawing in the background from the duties it owes to its residents, in guaranteeing them housing. What has happened as a result of this entire thing is now that we see unequal development, and the stats that you've provided are, interestingly, I think, you say at one point of time more than 50% of the TDR that was generated in the M East ward was not consumed within that ward, but was consumed in the western suburbs. So TDR generated in slums, then utilized in the more, prosperous western suburbs where land values are higher. So there seems to be this unequal development happening across the city, where it's all not uniform. So that's one problem, this unequal development, which then you also argue leads to social inequality. The social fabric of the city changes. And the second thing, which you speak about through case studies, and it's quite detailed, etc., is how the resettlement and rehabilitation program itself leads to widespread displacement of people, a loss of community for people, and it's not like that, when people move to these resettled colonies, they have better access to services. So your studies show, for example, with the Mumbai urban, transportation project, the Vidhi project, etc., once people move to these resettled colonies, survey results showed that it's not like they have better access to water, it's not like they have better access to education. You're just putting them from like a horizontal slum to a vertical slum, and that 2 kilometers away from where their original community was. So there are these two problems which we see in the way the Slum Act is playing out, in the way this rehabilitation is playing out. So again, coming back to, and I say that as a lawyer, very conscious of the fact that law is a very limited sort of instrument that can bring about change. The law is only as good as the people who implement the law. But yet coming back to again the law and policy, with these two problems in mind, what do you think is the solution to these two problems? It's, I know, massive. It's also like perhaps the answer is not in the law, you would tell me. But still, I would like to hear your thoughts on it.
Actually, I do believe that law is a very powerful instrument, especially in our context. And I would also believe that Maharashtra was a pioneer when it passed the Slum Act. There was no other state at that point in time which had a Slum Act. Okay? And the Slum Act automatically did two things. Number one, it empowered the state to declare a slum area. And we just think of declaration as a neutral act. But for me, I think when you look at it on the ground, it creates grounds for the state to actually intervene even in private area developments and speculations and giving of basic services. Okay. Many people are perhaps not aware of this, but there is also section 14, if I am not wrong, in the Slum Act, which also talks about if there is a cooperative society of the occupants of a settlement which comes together, pays something like 40 times the rent that they are currently paying, then they can be given the rights to that land. Okay. So there are extremely interesting provisions which are there, and I think it is the Slum Act which signaled this kind of a tolerance. It created a way for giving basic services to settlements. Interestingly, in the country in 1972, there was an environmental improvement of urban slum scheme which was brought in. But remember, Maharashtra brought in an act. The country brought in a scheme. Okay? And a scheme can always change, but I think there were these kind of grounds which were created in Maharashtra, which later on also went to a 1976 slum census. Again, the first initiative in the entire country, something which was a collaborative action in which housing right activists participated. A person like Madan Naik, whom I respect tremendously, he is no more today, but he, secretary like Gautam Chatterjee and the then chief secretary, who all backed up this exercise. Just imagine 40% of the city's population being enumerated, censused in the span of a single day, as is on this basis. After that, this exercise is not being repeated. But if you come to the Slum Act now, what is being done? And this is a Maharashtra Slum Act, it's not a Mumbai Slum Act. Okay? But the current versions of the Slum Act have done two things which are extremely wrong. In small articles, I have also written on this, but maybe these are not, I don't even know now whether they are on academia or whatever. Okay? But in 2001, 2002, after the slum rehabilitation scheme was brought into Maharashtra, there are two things which are being done. Number one, the provisions in the Act now talk of only a provision of resettlement or rehabilitation. Okay? So, what the entire title of the previous Act read, slum areas, declaration, improvement, relocation. So there were 3-4 things, okay? And now it becomes solely focused on rehabilitation. It introduces such penal provisions that if you refuse rehabilitation, you will not get another opportunity to get resettlement, okay? So just think of how there is now a homogeneity which is created within the Act. Instead of having a umbrella of approaches that can be done, you now have one singular approach. Okay? The second, there was an accompanying act which was brought in, and which is like a version of, I would say, it is called the Slum Dada Act, very popularly. Okay? But it is like a version of the TADA. Okay? And what it does is, encroachment becomes a non-bailable crime here. Okay? And through this, then the state found a fantastic way of acting. Okay? So you carry out an eviction, okay? And people who are poor, they recreate the structure. So now once you have recreated the structure, you are a encroacher. So if you look at the kind of penalization, there are some lawyers, I think Marut has done some study of this, and they find that if you look at what are the kind of crimes which have been registered under this Slum Act, who has been penalized, because this act also provides for penalization of officers, etc. There are no officers who have been tried under the act against whom a crime is registered. It is all the slum dwellers. So I think it is important to see what is happening in the law itself. The third reflection is at the level of rules in the act. Okay? So who should declare a slum? Previously the powers used to be with the collector, and the collector used to declare a slum and publish a list. Okay? Subsequently, now look at this for Maharashtra. Okay? The powers to declare a slum are now only with the state government and the UD department. So for people from different towns in Maharashtra, there is an extreme centralization which has happened. And I think often many of us don't think about this. Even through the rehabilitation mode, we are now saying that within the entire state of Maharashtra, nothing else can happen legally. The ultimate aim is to create rehabilitation schemes. Okay? There can be no upgradations possible even in the smaller towns of Maharashtra, where I think they are not as big real estate havens as Mumbai. Right? There could be a other variety of options which are available there. Okay? But I think what we have persisted in doing is this kind of a homogenized, highly imposing real estate linked solution that one is bringing. In fact, I would say that the phenomenon of the slum, even as a real estate or a land linked thing, is also widely varying in Mumbai. So for example, you will have central government lands, multiple, port trust, railways, forest, airports, defense, and posts, and so on and so forth. One can keep on adding to this. Then there are private lands, right? Privately owned land. 47% of slums in Mumbai are on private lands. Then one will also see lands which are situated and have multiple forms of tenancy. For example, Ramabai Colony at Koppal, a huge settlement, but it began as a municipal workers' colony. So there are chawls constructed by the municipal corporation where workers are paying rent. So you will see these kind of kernels, I would say. They are small pieces, but so the slum reality is also not all of encroachment, etc. But what we are trying to do is we are homogenizing everything. Kolivada has become slums. Now, of course, there is a contestation linked to that. I am happy about that. But everything one becomes a slum. Something which is not a building becomes a slum. Okay? So I think this is what is. And then what we do is to facilitate that creation of what they call as a formal settlement. There are two very big things besides all the impacts of displacement, etc. that you talked about. I want to just bring to your notice two things. The development plan of Mumbai, the base document of the development plan, not my statistic, that itself acknowledges that if you look at the overall land which is occupied by slums, especially in slum rehab areas, it gets reduced to 33% of the original area. So what does that mean? That in every slum rehab scheme, as a thumbs rule, this is not you go scheme by scheme, but 66% of the area gets used for profit purpose, and all the existing slum dwellers get accommodated on 1/3 of the land. So now look at the density proportions. Already we had roughly 50% of the population of the city staying on 7 to 8% of the land. Now you are going to reduce it to 1/3 of that land if all the slums are redeveloped. Okay? What are the implications of that? I think one needs to think about. So it is in some ways a structurally violent exercise. The second, to facilitate further the terms of the slum rehabilitation scheme, the density norms, the kinds of FARs which are given have been increased to, I would say, intolerable limits. Okay? And I think that is the other dangerous part of this entire thing. So what is our logic in giving rehabilitation or creating a rehabilitation scheme? The report of the Appraisal committee, which kind of formulated the slum rehabilitation schemes, is basically that we want to improve the living conditions of people. The second thing it says is that this is a report which acknowledges that slum dwellers have created value. So one is giving back that value. So these two things are there in the Appraisal committee. But on the other hand, the kind of density norms that one is creating, one is really creating vertical slums. In many ways, they will look great. Okay? And I think fortunately there are some slum rehab schemes which look now huge. They don't suffer from some of the deficiencies that I have seen previously. Like one of the first slum rehab schemes which was created in the city is one for Banjaras, Roma Banjara Tanda, it is called, located in Manpur. Okay, today if you will go to that society and see those buildings, there are 7-story buildings, but the last 3 stories, every room and the corridors have a cloth tied at the roof. That is the amount of leakage that they suffer. Okay? So you can imagine the state of the buildings. The corridors are dark, the corridors are double loaded. Okay? So there is hardly any light and ventilation within. So these were the first, where usually you had developers who were, extremely problematic developers. Often they didn't have enough working capital, so they start 3 schemes. यहाँ से काम छोड़ दो, वहाँ का शुरू कर दो, that kind of a thing. Today you see large developers, and when I've seen large developers, like if you look at Omkar's work in Malad, Indore Parel, and Sivri, and so on and so forth, okay? The schemes look good. You will have like German Schindler lifts and all of that, right? But the question is, when you are creating 30-story, 40-story, is one ever thinking of maintenance? And what are the maintenance costs which are being imposed in the long run, short run? जब तक developer है 5-7 साल निकल जाएंगे, उसके बाद क्या? Or is this one way of gentrification? Because then there will be other ways in which people will move out voluntarily out of these kind of buildings, and one will shift the slum problem from a Mumbai location to perhaps a peripheral location in Airoli, in Mira Bhayandar, or perhaps in Nalasopara. So one has not solved the problem, no? One has only shifted the location.
So then would you say that, this focus on rehabilitation under the law in any which way, and also the sort of like linkage with the real estate industry by way of these development incentives, is that something that we would definitely need to work towards and revamp?
Absolutely. No, I do believe that redevelopment or use of market incentives has a place. Okay? I'm not someone as an academic who believes that one should go against them. Okay? In fact, the slums are also a creation of the market and the state. I'm a very firm believer in that. Okay? So if that is so, I think if one has to combine and balance multiple objectives, one should be able to provide an umbrella of solutions. Okay? Because in some places, people themselves will be able to mobilize the resources and decide the direction of their development. And that is a freedom that one should allow. Okay? Similarly, there could be options such as self-redevelopment. There could be other kinds of imageries, right? And redevelopment can be one of those imageries.
So That's great, ma'am. And I want to pick on something that you mentioned quite early on, and you've written quite extensively about this. Is the violence, the structural violence that is inflicted on people who are living in these informal urban settlements by state actors, by non-state actors. Violence in like multiple forms. Could you just and you call them a spaces like a space of exception. That is where we get the topic for today's conversation. We call them spaces of exception because you call them spaces of exception. So just for the audience, would you firstly tell us why you call them a space of exception, and secondly speak a little more about this structural violence that is inflicted on the people who are living in these settlements?
So I do believe that slums are different, okay? But acknowledging the difference does not necessarily make it a exception. So why do I call it a space of exception? So there are two reasons for it. One is firstly, the state turns the slum into a space of exception once it acknowledges it as a political entity which cannot have an agency. Okay? So first is you remove their agency. Now this removal of agency itself started with I think when the slum started becoming a big part of the voting public, I would say. Okay? I'll give you one interesting story. Right? So this is as part of the slum sanitation program, which gave people options of different kinds of toilets, but people had to contribute towards them financially. Okay? We had politicians who very actively told people, "You contribute करते हो, we will give you a free toilet." Okay? Now understand this, that this is a denial of agency. The imagination that people have a stake and can contribute. In fact, they are making the shelters, they are making the infrastructure in the settlement. Nobody has given them. The initial years of a slum settlement, they are spent in such a lot of struggle. I think many of us will not imagine this. The kind of struggle, staying without any infrastructure, staying without any amenities, gradually building these up, in multiple ways, and all lots of jugaadu ways, but immense struggles. Okay, and with all of that, you come to a point, and then you are recognized by the state, and then the state says, "Hey, we will give you. You have nothing to do with this." And this is the beginning of making an exception. When it comes to, therefore, then a policy like resettlement, then this thing of agency becomes complete, right? Firstly, at least they talked about some community participation and consent, that 70% people have to agree. Now it has come down to saying, no, they are slum dwellers. We are giving them rehabilitation. So it's not a matter of them giving a consent at all. Either they can be a part of the scheme or they can be out. Right? So now just look at what happens to their agency. Okay? And we are playing with this sense of agency, restricting all their other options, okay? And then expecting them suddenly to become citizens. Because post-construction, post-redevelopment, then one says, okay, now you are a cooperative housing society, so you will take care of your maintenance, you have to pay for solid waste management, you have to pay your electricity bill. We prepare them for it. What have you done? What have you studied? Nothing. Okay? And I think this is how one creates the slum as a space for exception. Okay? Where the state creates an exceptional place, because definitely they have not been able to integrate the slum within the mainstream of society. Right? They have only integrated it and created an incentive for the real estate market to grow. Right? That's what has happened. Why is this a violent place, violent phenomenon? Why do I call it a structural violence? So here, firstly, I want to distinguish between violence and structural violence. Okay? So there is lots of, firstly, violence also involved in the SPST. So we know the nexus of politics, bureaucracy, crime very actively, which happens at various stages of the slum rehabilitation scheme. Okay? But perhaps going further than that explicit violence, physical violence, is really the story of structural violence. What is structural violence? The definition or the conceptual understanding of structural violence has 2-3 dimensions. Number one, it is a foreclosure, or it is a complete closure of options. Okay. Second, if one looks at the wider premise that people have to improve their own freedoms, okay, and they are struggling for that, then how is one, or how is the overall system behaving in a way that there are more enclosures, more barriers created towards that. Okay? So that's a very fascinating understanding of structural violence. Now what are we doing with the slum rehabilitation? Number one, I already talked to you about the space question. From 8% one is going down to 1/3, right? 33%, right? Second, no consent, no option, okay? But if you look at now the larger dimensions for this, earlier they had at least the freedom to stay put, right? There was a legitimation in some ways in the entire city. If you look at it as a child, I have grown up in this city, okay? But in Mumbai, I think the fascinating part is we don't consider a slum as out of place, right? Many of us get people who provide us services who stay in slums, and when they don't come, or at other points in time, one would make visits also to the settlements. I have attended multiple marriage and other ceremonies as well. Okay? Now, you are seeing therefore this as another part of the built environment, right? And there is a legitimacy. कौन कहता है? Okay, I stay in an apartment because I can afford it. There are still richer people who would stay in more luxury apartments, and there are poor people who don't afford it to stay in this settlement. Okay, what am I saying? There is a legitimation of a particular settlement, of why one stays there. What happens with the slum rehabilitation scheme? इनको तो फोकट में घर मिलता है, right? Now, if you look at its reflection in the law, the jurisprudence which results, because jurisprudence in the Mumbai High Courts, if you begin tracing it, you will increasingly see that there is a clear anti-slum attitude. Okay? Where they see what has been generated, find permanent options. Okay? There are so moto PILs which have been taken up, where in Bhiwandi there was a house collapse, right? And then one of the judges in Bombay High Court takes this up as a suo motu case, okay? And asks the state, why are there slums when you have so many acts, etc.? Penalize those officers, okay? Study from other countries' schemes and implement those here. And typically then there are 3 schemes cited, Singapore and whatever and whatever. Now, that is completely beyond. But what have you done in all of this business? Is basically said that, okay, slums ko to fukad ghar milta hai, and garib bechara middle class have to struggle all their way. So now middle class people also feel very antithetical. Tumko to fukad milne wala hai, mere bachchon ko struggle karne lag raha hai. So you understand, this is where the violence becomes much more deeper, and that is what is more dangerous to the existence of settlements, right? Even within themselves there are fights now. I remember in 2004-05, I was visiting a settlement in Zogeshwari, okay? And there was an eviction in progress. Okay? And one lady from the settlement who was working as a primary healthcare worker, she came and received me on the bus stop, and I was saying, ये क्या चल रहा है? ना कुछ नहीं है दीदी, ये तो 2011 के बाद, 2001 के बाद है. Now it is the person who is staying in that settlement who is ridiculing this part of the settlement because it is after 2001. Okay? At one point in time, we were thinking of struggles of the slum dwellers, organizing them, right? And the this is something else altogether, right? So I think when structures of society, when structures of law embed this kind of a hostility, they build in violence within them and delegitimate a phenomenon called slum, which actually has such intimate connections to you and me.
No, and then, I mean, this is going to be my last question. I actually had two, so I'm just going to combine them and ask. Is that, firstly, it would be great if you could speak about your work in the MWAT project. We'd love to know about the work and what it entails, in that particular project, the entire field action project. At least I'd love to know about it more. And the second thing, picking up on this violence bit, you also speak about hope, right? You also speak about the fact that despite living in these settlements and facing everyday violence of different forms from different actors, etc., you see these people making a claim to the city, fighting for their inclusion, fighting for their acknowledgement. So there is still some hope left when, despite facing all of this, you have people going and making those leaving those small invisible footprints, like you call them, making a claim to the city. So, because I'd like to end this conversation with some amount of hope that, despite the law being against them, despite like all our processes being against these people, you still have, these small wins every day that these people make. So could you please speak about that a bit, as well as, your perhaps, some of your experience from the MWAT project that also indicates towards this? That would be great.
Okay, thank you. So I'll talk about 3-4 aspects.
Yes.
And I hope I won't make it a very long answer, which I tend to. Right? But the first part, I think, of the MWAT project is basically that it was a build-up by, through the work of several of my PhD students, other researchers who were also associated, as well as activists who were associated. And I want to acknowledge at least a few of them in my academy. So one is the work of Nautesh Kaur Bhutani, who used to work with an organization called Yuva, and she was pursuing her PhD work. I was one of her supervisors. One of the things which really struck us is that we are talking of MUTP at that point in time, the Mumbai Urban Transport Project, is creating a lot of resettlement. And somehow all of that resettlement seems to be focused in particular areas of the city. And that happened to be the MES ward. So with the MUTP and MUIP, there were about 100,000 households who were shifted from different parts of the city into one ward. Households, which means like an addition of at least 4 to 5 lakh population. Okay. Now this is huge. Right? So this is something which struck us. Why does this happen? How does this happen? And which is where all of that slum TDR, etc., kind of came. The second thing that we started looking at is with this, it was not just the resettlement zoning which was happening, but we also saw till that time, till 2000 or so, there were only 2 SRA projects in the entire MES. Because ये तो झोपड़पट्टियों का वार्ड है, यहाँ पे कौन मार्केट क्या है, who are the real estate players, etc., etc. But suddenly with MUIP and MUTP, the real estate market started opening up, okay? And you started also seeing other kinds of private developments. Okay? So things which seemed non-penetrable by the real estate market suddenly became penetrable. The influence of the real estate on everyday life in settlements was huge. Okay? So for example, even in bastis where there is no legal water, where there is no legal electricity, okay, you see a 10 by 15 jhopda sells at more than 50,000. Okay. Now it is even more, but this is about 10-15 years ago that I am talking about. And which is what started shifting around. Okay. I have been involved in the ME's ward since around 1985, 90 or so, okay, with different organizations, not through this project kind of a move. And the different organizations were doing very interesting work. So there is Up The Ante, there was Kogo, then different. Okay. But we started seeing that they are looking at it at a community level. Okay. All changes which are happening. But what was happening now was really happening at a different scale of things. Okay. And which is why we conceptualized, yes, we need to think something about this, talk about larger questions of justice. Okay. And therefore conceptualize change also at a ward level, administrative ward level. Now, which is very different. This is not an electoral ward, not a municipal ward. We are talking of an administrative ward which in itself contains more than 10 municipal wards. Okay? So people are organized differently, but can we begin to think about the ward as a scale because of the kind of developments which are happening. Okay? Now that really became the entry point for the MBOD project. Okay? But beginning from there, then the MBOD project has moved into different realms. So at the time when we started the project, there were about 19 different communities in the entire ME's ward which were constantly on the brink of eviction. Some of them were undergoing evictions multiple times a year. Right? So where we have seen in the immediate wake of evictions, women delivering on the road, okay, or children falling ill, dying, dropping out. In 2011, TISS did a study with several of its students and faculty, large numbers of faculty who were part of it. And one of the conclusions that this study drew was basically that there were things which were happening together. In bastis which were constantly being evicted, one also saw a low level of human development. These are the bastis where it is likely that there are going to be more maternal mortalities. These are the bastis where there are higher levels of malnourishment. These are the bastis where there will be larger numbers of school dropouts, okay, and so on. Okay. Now when this kind of a conclusion came, there is an insight into why does ME's ward have the lowest human development index in the entire city. So if one has to do something to transform these conditions, you have to do things at a multiple levels. Okay. So I will just mention two scales of intervention and talk about that hope. One is the hope really that we have to build up on the agent, and which was demonstrated in the kind of resistance to huge evictions which happened in the city in 2003-04. Because despite all of those evictions, people were protesting, people were participating in struggles, and we decided that we will be like the back office of some of these struggles. Okay? As a university, you cannot participate in struggles. Okay? So what does it mean by becoming a back office? Okay? We know that a struggle is an event, a protest is an event, but you still have children who are dropping out, you have children who are unable to get registered in schools. Okay? So we started community education centers for them in those bastis which were getting evicted. Okay? Which also meant that our community centers would also get evicted when the basti got evicted. Okay? And we recreate again. Okay? So that is like one of the things that we began doing. The other part of this agency, very interestingly, we saw that people are constantly innovating on things. Okay? Open space. There is big amounts of open space in this world, but which is completely inaccessible to people. So it is all within the boundaries of the BRC, or these are mangroves which are now declared forests, so you can't go there. Okay? So these kind of green areas. So how do you create interesting spaces? How do you make them accessible to people? And we tried experimenting in one of the settlements. Fortunately, we had a very interesting assistant commissioner at that time who came with us to the basti. Children performed the program, and we said, "Bachas have no place to play." Okay? And he said, what do you want? We said, we want 2 truckloads of debris. Okay. So he gave us 2 truckloads of debris. We leveled up some land there, and the volunteers in the Basti put up interesting play, hidden talents which also came out at that time, like people who had taken draftsman training, but who then participated in actually mapping their entire community. So fun things, and we were able to talk to the scale of a city. We were successful to the extent that even today, the entire development plan report for Mumbai has a special section on the award. There is a special thing there, and which talks about how the entire social amenities in the ward need to be enhanced. Because our main question was, this is a ward where the state itself is not thinking about any strategies for how to improve the development index. Like when we started work, there were only 2 secondary principal schools in the entire ward. Okay. So you have a ward of over 800,000 populations and 2 secondary principal schools, which means that you want the students to only learn till primary level. So you have these kind of exclusions which are built in. So it's a mix of advocacy, some action on the ground, some knowledge generation products.
Thank you so much, Dr. Bhide. I think what I'm taking back from this conversation personally is a few things. One is, of course, again, on the law and policy side, our planning laws need to be revamped. And like you said, the planning law which now accounts for a general public interest. I mean, I think the provisions on sending comments also, there's just one provision which says you can send in comments to the draft development plan. And there is no mention about whether they are even bound to accept those suggestions, reject those suggestions, or even call for hearings. So there's like a very skeletal provision which is there in the planning law, which of course needs to be strengthened. And of course, I think the idea behind a planning law, I mean, we need to shift our approaches to, like you said, a right to the city conversation sort of thing. That everybody who lives in a city has a right to that city, and let's plan our cities taking everybody into account, as opposed to only people who have property. I think that's the one takeaway I have when it comes to planning of our cities. The second sort of takeaway that I have from this, especially on the Slum Act and the Slum Rehabilitation Project, is that we need to have an umbrella of solutions, like you said, under our slum laws. You want to redevelop them, rehabilitate them, but also give them other options, in order to sort of get out of that entire situation. Perhaps, like you said, take up self-redevelopment. So an umbrella of options under our slum laws, and not just a very single-minded focus on rehabilitation and redevelopment. And I think also the other thing that goes with it is this de-linking that needs to happen, some sort of a de-linking, not a complete de-linking between development incentives that the market decides and rehabilitation projects. That's the second thing that I'm taking with it. And I think the third thing, which is more on the violence, how we legitimize these settlements around us, we just accept it as a way of life, like you said, is that some people live in slums. These people who work for you, are probably cooking for you, are probably looking after your houses, are making sure that each of us get to our work and generate all of this economic activity, go to office, go to work, etc. The people guarding your buildings in the night. All of these people perhaps live in these settlements, and we are just okay with the fact that they live in these settlements because too bad they can't afford it. So this sort of like legitimization that happens on an everyday basis, we have to be more conscious about it in our everyday lives, and perhaps not just take it as a given, and see if there is a way in which we can sort of contribute to alleviating their condition in some way. I think that's the sort of like third takeaway that I have.